used to indicate the whereabouts of the weed creature. The plan was to cover the top of one of the fort towers with foam to indicate that it was the nerve centre of the weed creature's invasion. To effectively accomplish this, however, the foam machine required a large supply of fresh water, as it could not operate effectively using the salt water surrounding the fort. To this end, Bryant organised an advanced trip to the Red Sands Sea Fort to deal with the problem.
I booked a scene crew. We hired sufficient 5-gallon drums to make up the 300 gallons of fresh water. We got in a scenery lorry and we all drove down to Margate, where I'd booked a fishing boat. We filled up the drums with fresh water and we got in the fishing boat, and it was a very pleasant day, and we set sail out for the fort, where I knew it would be possible for the 6 of us to carry these water drums up to the top of the fort. Except, of course, we arrived out of this fort in this fishing boat. 3 of the prop men were sick. The other 2 were looking green, and one of them was saying, "I didn't join the BBC to do this, brother." We arrived at the legs of the fort, and as always, there was a considerable swell. I mean, there was about a 6-foot swell. So the fishing boat from the steel ladder was going up and down 6 feet, and the iron ladder was dodging. And the scene crew weren't very enthusiastic. So I stood on the bows of the boat and said, "Okay, I'll go first, and the rest of you guys can follow." So I rather foolishly probably leapt off the bows of the boat onto the iron ladder. And the guys said, "Look, absolutely not. We're not going to do this. It's very dangerous." And I thought about it and went, "Yeah, this is. I mean, I'm asking these guys to do too much." So the fishing boat came back in, and I jumped back off onto the fishing boat and went back to base. We then motored back with the guy still being ill, and we poured the water out of the containers, reloaded it all back into the scenery lorry, and we all drove back to London, which was rather an expensive day wasted. And I still had got the problem.
The problem was finally solved by hiring the services of some of the local fishermen at Whitstable, who transported the water containers out to the fort and carried them up to the top of the tower. On Saturday the 3rd of February, the date that episode 4 of the Web of Fear was being recorded at Lime Grove Studio D, Hugh David and his team travelled to Margate and booked into their production hotel, the Nayland Rock. The following morning, having been joined by Patrick Troughton, Fraser Hines and Deborah Watling, filming began at nearby Botany Bay, Kingsgate, on the opening sequences of the story. Pemberton's original script for episode 1 had the TARDIS landing on the edge of a cliff, followed by the travellers climbing down onto the shoreline below. But Hugh David felt that the opportunity beckoned to try something a little more inventive, something like the TARDIS flying down onto the surface of the sea.
Then we came to the shot of the TARDIS landing on the sea. So we had this little 2-foot, 3-foot TARDIS on a piano wire to be suspended below the Hughes 300 helicopter with Mike Smith flying it. So anyway, Mike takes off in his helicopter, flies up in the air, flies 100 yards out to sea, lowers the TARDIS in on the end of its 200-foot piano wire, which kept the helicopter out of the top of frame. Fine. TARDIS comes down, lands on the sea, flops straight on its side. Because although the baby TARDIS was made of wood, of course we hadn't worked out that it wasn't going to float upright. So he flew back, landed. He said, "Look, I need someone to talk me down so that I can see what it is." So I said, "Yeah, okay, well, I'll go and do that." So I climbed in the helicopter with Mike. We took off, flew out there, and I sat in the seat beside him saying, "Down, down, down." But the problem was, which neither of us had really worked out, was from the seats, you couldn't see the baby TARDIS, which was directly suspended by piano wire from the centre of the helicopter. So I said, "Mike, I can't see it." He said, "Oh, well," he said, "you'll have to take off the seatbelt, take off the safety strap, climb out onto the skid and talk me down from the skid." So I said, "Okay, right you are." So I climbed out, stood on the skid of the helicopter and talked him down, because I could then see the TARDIS spinning there, and I said, "Down, down, 2 foot, 1 foot, steady, she's there, up a bit, down." And I suddenly realized there I was, connected to the helicopter by only a headset, standing on the skid, holding on with one hand, 300 feet above sea level. Madness. I could have been fired from the BBC for such infringements of the safety regulations. But Mike was a great guy, a great helicopter. He knew I was perfectly safe. He would never have asked me to do anything that was, what am I saying? The guy was out of his tree. He was the craziest pilot I've ever met. Nicest guy, brilliant pilot, do anything.
In order to get the Doctor and his companions to the beach to begin their adventure, it was decided that a more conventional form of transport could be used. But when filming began, even this was not without its problems.
Hugh's sort of second mind-blowing idea was he wanted the TARDIS to land at sea. He said, why does it always land conveniently at land? Why doesn't it land on the sea? And if it lands on the sea, of course it will float. And then they'll have to come ashore in a rubber boat. And I was going, rubber boats? Oh no, not rubber boats. He said, yes. He said, that's great. It'll be really great. We can have this rubber dinghy. Pat's a sailor. Pat's a dinghy sailor. He knows about boats. We'll just have an outboard motor, and Pat can drive the rubber dinghy with he and Fraser on board. So Avon's provided us, I think, with the Avon dinghy, and the outboard motor was coming from another company, Yamaha or Seagull or something. Can't quite remember where. But that was all being delivered brand new down to Margate for us. And we were to operate it ourselves. So we started off that day, and there was the Avon dinghy, there was the outboard motor, but Avon's had forgot to pack the outboard motor bracket. So we couldn't operate the Avon dinghy with the outboard motor. We had to have Pat row the dinghy ashore, which is what he did.
For the filming at the Red Sands Sea Fort, 2 helicopters were used. A Hughes 300 flown by Mike Smith, which later appeared in both the Demons and the Green Death, and a larger jet-powered Mark II Alouette, which would subsequently appear the following year as the unit helicopter in the Invasion. Pilot Mike Smith rapidly made his mark on the cast and crew in a variety of different ways, as assistant floor manager Margot Hayhoe remembers.
I well remember the first time we met him in the evening at the bar of the hotel, and he had a little party trick, and that was eating the wine glass that he'd had his wine from, which is quite an unusual thing to do, I think. And I remember Victor Madden, who played the baddie in that particular episode, was in the bar, and said to us, who is that man who's eating the glass? And Michael Bryant said, oh, that's Mike Smith, he's the pilot of the helicopter. And Victor Madden went rather pale and very quiet, because the next day he was due to be piloted by Mr. Smith, and he was just a little bit worried. But it all went very well the next day, and in fact that was one of my first experiences of flying in a helicopter. And I made the fatal mistake when I went with Mike. We had to take the props from the top of the hill at Margate down to the beach. Having been in a helicopter before, I got quite nervous, and as it took off, I was so startled at the way that the earth just fell from my feet, because it was a glass bubble, and I screamed. Of course, this was the signal for him to have lots of little tricks and bounce around in the helicopter, and by the time I got down to the beach, of course, I was a shaking jelly, but everybody else found this terribly amusing, and looking back on it, actually, so did I.
For the majority of the flying sequences, the film camera, operated by Ken Westbury, was mounted in the Alouette, while most of the action was accomplished using the Hughes 300. For the Doctor and his companions' escape from the gas platform in Episode 6, Hugh David wanted to emphasise the fact that the Doctor was not at all familiar with the discipline of flying a helicopter. But first, Mike Smith's features needed to be disguised so that he could pass as the Doctor in long shot.
I do have a little receipt for a pair of tights that I bought to replace a pair for the makeup supervisor who had used hers to disguise the face of Mike Smith, as he was meant to be the Doctor when he was flying the helicopter, though at that distance I'm sure nobody would have actually seen.
One of the ways that the Doctor flying the Hughes 300 was meant to escape from the baddie in the Alouette was by flying in between the legs of the fort. Very, very dangerous. Totally against the law. I mean, totally against the aviation, because 27 years later, it doesn't matter talking about it now. But I mean, what we asked Mike Smith to do was, with the Hughes 300, which has, say, a 20-foot wingspan, was to fly in between legs of a fort where, you know, it's something like 30 foot. I mean, he had a clearance of something like 5 or 6 feet on either side. I mean, madness. Absolute madness. Very dangerous. Totally against aviation laws. And when I remember discussing it with Mike and saying, listen, you know, we're not forcing you to do this. It's very much optional. And he said, no, that's all right. Yeah, I think we can do that. And Mike was nervous about it. Mike Smith was very nervous about it. It was about the most, he told me later, it was about the most dangerous thing he'd ever done in his life. And he'd flown in Korea or something. So they flew out and Hugh directed the sequence from the helicopter and they landed back having achieved everything they wanted to achieve, I think, with shots of Mike flying in between the legs. And he landed back at Margate. You know, I mean, Mike Smith was then on a real adrenaline high. He had never done anything like it in his life. And we finished filming that day, went back to the hotel in Margate for the last night before we all travelled back to London. And Mike was in an amazing mood. Hugh had gone back to London, and some of the other actors are, but all the makeup, wardrobe, props, me, the production, most of the production people were still there. And Mike Smith came in the lounge, which was a rather elegant hotel with a beautiful chandelier in the middle of the ceiling and nice club armchairs and quite a dignified place. And Mike came in and he ordered a bottle of brandy and a crate of champagne. And we said, well, you know, Mike, BBC budget. He said, no, this is on me. I've never done anything so exciting in my life. So come along, we're going to celebrate the achievement of flying a 20-foot wingspan helicopter through a 30-foot gap. Champagne, brandy arrived, so we had a mixture of brandy and champagne all round. And then he said, right, another crate of champagne and another bottle of brandy. So we had that. And it was at that point that I was sitting in my armchair trying to go, I am a BBC production manager. I have to exercise. I have some responsibility for this. I mean, it was a great evening. A lot of laughter, a lot of fun, really nice people. But nonetheless, we were all getting sort of quite high on a mixture of brandy and champagne. At that point, Michael pulled me over backwards in my armchair and then thrust another glass of brandy and champagne in my hand and said, hey, drink that. And I went, well, yes, Mike, thank you very much, but I really think... He said, Michael, don't be so BBC. You've got to live a little, you've got to risk a little, you've got to enjoy life a little. And he said, do you know, Michael, there's something I've never done. I've never swung like Errol Flynn from a chandelier. But tonight, and I said, Michael, please don't do it. He said, watch me. And he leapt up on the table, and he was a tall, good-looking guy with a little goatee beard. He said, watch this, climbed up on the table, said, yahoo, jumped in the air, grabbed the chandelier, swung across the room, and the chandelier came out of the ceiling, and 3/4 of the ceiling came down on top of him. Laugh. There was Mike, covered in white plaster, sitting in the middle of this living room floor, whilst the resident, well, what do? You have to laugh, don't you? Anyway, he was all right. He wasn't hurt, which was the main thing. I was just left with the slightly embarrassing situation that I had to apologize to the hotel. And they didn't mind. We had been good customers. And it was a great evening. But another thing you learn working in television is don't swing from chandeliers in strange hotels unless you've had somebody test them first.